So you're up, Larry.
All right. Good afternoon, and especially to those joining us early afternoon out in the Pacific time zone, including our two authors today and many of you, I think most of you today in the audience. We appreciate you taking some time out of the middle of your Saturday for some poetry. I'm Larry Moore. I'm the publisher of Broadstone Books, coming to you from 3 hours in the future here in Kentucky. And where I'm joined in her studio by my design partner, Stephanie Potter, who is our host today, along with our seldom seen but always appreciated technical support and security guru, Caleb Brown. Now, wherever and whenever you are, we're delighted to welcome you to the October 2021 edition of the Broadstone Reading Stage, our monthly Zoom series of readings, of which this is lucky 13. And I'm always happy to see some other Broadstone authors in the audience, which is nice, because I always like to say that Broadstone is not merely a publishing company, we are a community. And today we're welcoming 2 new members with new books to that community. Patrick Daly, joining us from Menlo Park, California, and David Hargraves, zooming in from a bit farther north of there, up in Independence, Oregon. I'll introduce both writers here at the start of the program, after which each will read from their new books and anything else they feel like sharing with us today. And then we should have some time at the end for some questions and comments from those of you in the audience. I will remind everyone to please stay muted, though, until that time so that we don't have disturbances for our readers. Patrick Daly says that he writes his poetry on his lunch breaks during his day job in the software industry. But based on his success in getting those poems published widely in well-respected journals and anthologies, we could all wish to be so productive. And pretty clearly, he's a poet first and foremost, and software is his side hustle. He has previously published a prize-winning chapbook, Playing with Fire, and now makes his full-length collection debut with Grief and Horses. In his cover endorsement, Jeremy Rudkin, who I see is in the audience with us today, he speaks of the crunch of that title, Grief and Horses, and I think that's a wonderful word. It's an arresting and intriguing title. And as he goes on to say, it promises much abstract/actual, rippling perspective, emotion, and natural beings. And to say the least, Patrick delivers on all of that promise. Now, Patrick also has the distinction of being married to another Broadstone poet, Charlotte Muse, who's with us today. And together they have the distinction of being one of 4 Broadstone author couples, but I think the only case where we have 2 poets trying to coexist under the same roof. So very, very brave of the 2 of you. Charlotte and Patrick together were founders of the Out of Our Minds, a primetime poetry show, still running on KKUP radio in Cupertino, California. And they are part of a very active poetry circle that has produced another upcoming Broadstone author who's with us today, Mary Detterer, and her book will be coming out soon. So we welcome Patrick, thus, as both an author and a very excellent and active literary citizen. Now, our second reader today is David Hargraves. Now, he's a Detroit native who's now living way out west in Oregon. And his path to poetry has also been a journey. Through his academic specialty as a professor of linguistics at Western Oregon University. He's a leading Western authority on the, I hope I say this right, David, the Bhasa language of Nepal. And in addition to his many scholarly works, is the translator of the collection of Bhasa poetry, The Blossoms of 64 Sunsets, by a poet whose name I'm going to let you pronounce later, David, rather than me mangling it now. Now, his own poetry has appeared in many journals, and he makes his book debut today with Running Out of Words for Afterwards. Now, I find that title just a little misleading because it's very plain that David has ample words at his disposal and he deploys them quite masterfully. He says his poetry is tuned to his background in translation, and many of his poems are set in one way or another in Nepal. But it's more a case of the spirit that animates and connects the poems in this collection as they range over a wide variety of themes of contemporary life. Troy Jollimore has described David as being on a continuing journey, and this book an invitation to become a fellow traveler. And Devin Walker Figueroa writes that his poetry proffers a world that is constantly, perhaps even ecstatically, ceasing to be itself, and in so doing, revising the lives of all who dwell in it. That's a pretty good description of the effect of David's poetry as well. To read it is to come away changed for the better. Now, to begin our program this afternoon, let's welcome Patrick Daly to the Broadstone Zoom stage. Hello, Patrick. Patrick, you need to unmute.
Okay. Thank you, Larry, and thank you to all at Broadstone for publishing my work, and thank you for putting on this afternoon's event, and thank all of you for coming. I'm delighted to see you all, and I'm going to talk as little as possible and read also, not overstay my welcome reading either. So the first poem I'm going to read was inspired by the sculpture of a horse that stands in the foyer of the Cantor Gallery at Stanford. And the sculpture was made by Deborah Butterfield, who specializes in driftwood horses. She casts them from driftwood. And the plaque, I think they've changed it now because they might have realized the unconscious humor in the plaque that was originally there, but the full text of the original plaque is the title of my poem, Bronze Horse Cast from Driftwood, Do Not Touch. Now here's the poem. These are the trees the wind blew down. This is the wood the rivers washed away and waves brought back. These are the limbs scattered and collected. This is the mind, and these are the hands. This is the clay casing. This is the wood burned away, and this is the metal sputtering into the mold. These are the ashes brushed away, and the metal has turned to branches. These are trees recollected in metal, purged to their effigies, shaken free of themselves, swept up into horse. This is the horse recollected in branches, lashing in the mane, the tail, the belly. This is the horse of the hands of water, wind, and metal. This is the horse standing lifelike. In the mind, the dead stand like this, turning to look. This is the horse turning to look, to bite at a fly, so lifelike. A notch for an eye, so lifelike. How can you bear not to touch? And the next poem, there are a lot of crows and ravens in our neighborhood, and I tend to write about them. So this one is called Another Crow. It lifted itself from a branch and flew and settled. How black it shone against the gray of not yet spring, stark as the bare tree. For a wing beat, I felt myself pitching into crow, all the not enough that is bird in me wanting to fan out into black, to feel the inklings of blackness prickle my veins, while a black beak began to refine my bones. How strong longing is. I was ready to let go and take that cold, bright, prying grip upon the world, just across the road in one beaten glide, to stretch wings at the tips like aching fingers and stall and settle. For 3 moments of flight, I would have ceased this human leaning into otherness and leapt into crow forever. And though I was not bird enough, too much a man waiting for a bus under low cloud, I felt my balance tip crowward by a feather, a tickle of black brilliance, something light as a shadow crossed my heart. And this is a longer poem with an epigraph from Genesis chapter 6, verse 9. Noah was a just man, and Noah walked with God. And I chose to take walked with God, perhaps more literally than the biblical author intended. I guess I was wondering what it was like to be Noah. Did Noah ask God as they walked together, what about the girls on the river path on his way to work, giggling in knots, loitering back from the first milking, the men fishing in the brightening gray, the women building up the fires, the mice and lizards starting at his tread, rustling to safety in vain, the boys following him, calling his name, the younger ones wheedling for something sweet, the boulder imitating his walk, the walk of a man being careful not to seem pleased with himself. Did he remember years and years ago how the girls looked at him, and did he still have affection for the cover of certain trees in their last leaves now, with their prescient birds shaken in an ill wind? Or did he just squat without a word and scratch down 300 by 50 by 30 cubits, start sketching the window here so high, the door here, sucking his teeth at the length of the keel, the draft so many times deeper than the river would bear? How was he going to explain that? Could he already feel himself riding steadily upward on the waters, looking down at the people clinging to the oars? Could he already see them letting go, sinking towards the flowers, the cows thrashing and roaring, the vigorous goats faltering, the crocodiles feasting for now? Did he wonder what had gotten into him when he began these walks with God? Did he look into his heart and draw breath to say no, all or none, and the ark, this earth that holds us? Did he ask aloud, what is justice? I suppose he thought, God is the Lord of hosts and I'm only Noah. Thinking it was going to be a lot to make an ark in a week, and his wife and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives and their children, and 1 pair of every unclean beast, and 7 pairs of every clean beast was going to be a lot to round up and bring on board. And I suppose he saw that not even God can keep himself from choosing, and went home and took his wife in his arms, and later lay in the dark awake, and still awake until he got up and howled at the stars. But I wish he had felt the giants and the great men of his youth at his back and risen to the no. He could have argued his modest boat building skills, the difficulties in finding and cutting gopher wood. He could have started on a bigger ark, impossibly huge, multiplying the cubits out to absurdity. He could have bargained for time, which God has always plenty of. And this next poem is a sonnet, and it's written in memory of our dear friend, Bob Evans. And I'm dedicating this to Daly, his partner, who is here. Bob jumping. Bob told us he had once stood on a ledge and tried to get himself to leap. Really no leap at all, a mere 6 feet, if he had not looked down over the edge, down and dizzyingly down, an abyss. No way back or forward, only rock steep above and falling off into the deep. Just jump. Just couldn't. So he didn't budge all day until the day began to dim. And then he laughed and leapt and was home free. Years later now, he's gone. Charlotte said he had met death the way he lived, willingly took off when it was time. I might still be hesitating. I want to jump like him. Now a couple of poems in memory and memories of my dad. And the first one is the title poem of the collection, Grief and Horses. Excuse me. We still have lingering after effects of the smoke here, and it's getting to me, I'm sorry. Grief and Horses. The horses on the other bank waiting as ours cross the soaking, sucking meadow and clomp in the fast water too strong for our feet. Their rumps to us, their riders letting them gaze, their haunches bunching as they shift their weight and easing, bunching and easing like water over rock gathering and falling. The sun on bay, pink dappled, snow melt spotted brown flanks that make you think of the ruddy cores of fallen pines. Rings that counted the years crumbled and spilled, softening into dust. How hard it is to write this beauty aright. That the earth, with so little effort, raises up, and with less, scarcely a shiver, sucks back when it falls. Every hold relaxes in time, and this means death to us, and the tearing effort of grief that is much like dying, like bursting through something that still resists. A great handsome horse, sure of its path, surging where we did not think a path could be made. Strong, cold, white as water falling. And this next poem is both to and about my dad. And it also has a biblical epigraph. The title of the poem is When He Was Good, and the epigraph is, the sun shall not smite thee by day, nor the moon by night. Out of nights of flying ants, the tall mud towers where people lit fires to burn them out because these ants are a delicacy. The wings, or did I imagine this, glowing in the firelight. All dark except the ant fires and the thin shaft of our headlights baffled by the dark. The swift dark of the equator and sudden heat of day, ripening coffee berries, a forest of vanilla, the yesterday, today, and tomorrow tree beside the veranda, the frangipani, huge cracks in the earth and red dust before the rains came like armies. The black mamba you disturbed in the woodpile early one morning and brought into our bedrooms for us to admire, dead, dangling from the machete, and Harriet obligingly screamed. From this steam of delicious soup that could never be England, from under the father wings of the memory of 11, arises a trip, a long, long trip in a car on a road not particularly meant for cars, and darkness again as an inn far out in the wilderness, the bush. And we sat outside to eat by lamplight, a symphony of insects and monkeys in the trees. Or else no, we sat inside in a dining room with oil lamps and fans where you ordered yoti qua yoti, everything for everyone. And it was in the morning we sat outside after a night hardly asleep because of the bats. A trestle table perhaps under a flowery trellis, and ate water buffalo meat, pale and stringy. You would not think it good for breakfast in the dawn following the zooming night of the bats and their wing brushings. But I remember how good it was. And later that day in the game reserve, the Queen Elizabeth National Park, after I took a photo of a living water buffalo and an African buffalo and long grass where a lion really was, the car came tiredly to a stop. And you got out and opened the hood and found the water hose broken and tore the plastic lining from our mother's travel kit and patched it. And you and I walked, your shadow enfolding me against the earth-cracking heat, to a water hole where there was a rhino, I may have imagined, and a hippo, and hippos I haven't, low in the water like fallen trees with faces for roots, cheeks and nostrils of stupendous uncles, only their eyes moving as we did, allowing us to fill our can. And we walked back, and I wanted to hold your hand, although I was too old, because it was marvelous. And the car started smooth as a cat. You were marvelous that day when your shadow in the heat was still large enough to hold me without harm. That day and a little longer. Another change of pace. This poem is called The War. The war is on the table. The war is on our plates. The mud, the gray rain, the flashes, the hole that used to be somebody is on our plates. We have been eating it all along. The dinner, the wine, the walk under the lamps, even the stars we have plucked like trout from a stream and eaten damp and fresh. The maple leaves, red and copper in tomorrow's light, have been the war. Why, we say why, but we say it quieter and less. There's no point in arguing. There are fresh holes to dig, munitions to keep dry, guns to undress and wipe and oil like babies. The people we keep trying to kill, we have already killed. Everything is out of date, but there is no point in arguing. We are tired, but the war is not. It is having us for breakfast. It is fresh as a daisy, bright as a star. It knows it is winning. It can see the ticker tape already, the showers of rose petals, the willing girls. It sees already a prosperous middle age, a professorship, a foundation, no problems. There will always be enough of us, whoever dies, always young enough, however old, to carry on. The war is happy as we were before we guessed it, before we glimpsed it on our plates, or knew we had eaten its hook, when every gasping fish mouth was still a star. Larry, how am I doing for time?
Just had to unmute. You're doing fine. You go on for a few more.
Okay. I'm doing a little editing here. That one. I think I'll just end with these two. This was one hoping to lighten the tone after the war. This is called Hen and Pastry Bag. And somewhat as with Noah, I wonder what it would be like to be a hen. This is a particularly beautiful hen. Hen and pastry bag. Glorious I am. My pyramid tail of flame and gold, my silk fine neck turnings. Beauty, gently as I wear it, is what I bring to the morning light. Stooping, inspecting, not that, but now this, with an opening, delicious, delicious, surely safe to put my head in. All this is the small work of the day. The great work, oh, the sun in the tower of my tail, my neck turning and turning, silvery flowing and changing. And I'm going to end with this one. And this was prompted by Bill Evans playing Blue and Green, which maybe Bill Evans wrote and maybe Miles Davis did. They never resolved it. But I also borrowed perhaps not just the mood, but the fact that on Portrait in Jazz, there are 3 takes of Blue and Green. So I wrote this poem in 3 takes. Take 1. Water like peace, a fountain, and bare slender trees trickling up into gray, floated without beginning or cease. February wind floated the daffodils, a chill day with sunlight now, and Bill's hands floating on the keys. Take 2. I stopped for water intricately falling. A fountain, trees, bare and slender, were trickling upward into gray sky, like wordless prayers. A river flowing without cease. A chill wind floated the daffodils. February sunlight now, with Bill's hands floating on the keys. Take 3. I stopped for water intricately falling. A fountain with trees, bare spindles, trickling upward into gray. The music of peace has no words, though poets and prayers try to speak for rivers flowing without cease. Daffodils were flying in a chill breeze. Evening has come to this February day, in sunlight now, with Bill's hands floating on the keys. Thank you.
Oh, and thank you so much, Patrick, for that. Several things that I could say in response, but one line, I think the line that struck me the most in this reading and possibly even when reading through the manuscript originally, and it's in the Crow poem where you talk about leaning into otherness. And that's, I think, a great thing that poetry does at its best, guiding us into otherness. And you do a particularly good job of leaning into that otherness of other creatures. And your hen poem is a good case in point of that. So I just wanted to particularly point out that quality of your writing that I admire so much. And I also want to say I'm very happy that you read the Noah poem, which is probably my favorite in the collection, especially for that just really arresting final line. In one of your father poems, you give us some insight into your very eclectic background and the fact that you've traveled widely to get to where you are today. So, but of course, you've also traveled into the world of poetry. So I'm always interested when I have poets on who are writing from outside of the academic poetry world. Last month, we had a couple of poets that we spoke to about that. You work outside of that kind of formal world of poetry. So talk a little bit about your journey into poetry and how it kind of relates to the rest of your life, if you will.
Well, I always loved poetry, and to be honest, for a long time, to me, Shakespeare was poetry. In a British boarding school, they make you, which is a good thing, one of the few good things about British boarding schools, they make you not only read, but memorize Shakespeare early. And I remember at about the age of 11, about the age I was in the poem about the national park, having to memorize Friends, Romans, Countrymen, Mark Antony's speech in Julius Caesar. And I was just spellbound. I thought it was absolutely wonderful. I still do. But then, but I didn't, my dad and I both sort of like to write verse, like to write little jingles. And I mean, he, of course, led me to do that. And he was much better at it than he, I never got to be as good at it as he was. Very good at just coming up with with a little rhyme for an occasion. Charlotte also is really good at it. You don't see that side of Charlotte in her published work, but anyway. But when I was about 15, I had an English teacher whom I much admired, who died recently, Nigel Dodd. And he said that he had been asked to collect some poems from our school to be published in an anthology of, well, this is Bristol, England, an anthology of Bristol school-age writers. And he said, well, you know, Patrick, do you write poetry? I said, no, I don't do that. But anyway, so I went back to my study in the boarding school, and I wrote something, and I handed it, and I said, you know, you asked, so here's something. And to my surprise, it did quite well. The editors liked it and published it, and I thought, oh, this is going to be easy. Of course, everybody knows that it's not easy. It's not easy to write. It's not easy to get published. It's not easy to get anyone to read what you have written and published, but it is worth it. So anyway, from then on, I've written. I try to write these days, taking it's either Dorothea Brand or Brenda Euland's advice to write at least 2 minutes every day, because as whichever one of them it was said, everyone has 2 minutes. And even if you write, I really don't want to do this today, you've written something. So anyway, so that's my practice. I do try to do that. So that's something you can sort of work around doing, you know, having a job. And I have to admit that, especially since, you know, my company went belly up in the pandemic, so I can say this without fear of spies reporting it back, I occasionally did steal a little bit of time from an employer. Anyway, that's probably more than I need to say.
Well, that's all lovely to know. And my final question is a little bit of a personal one, but I alluded to the fact that you and Charlotte are two Broadstone authors under the same roof. So did the two of you find one another through poetry, or was it just a coincidence that the two of you are poets?
We were actually, my friend Jeremy Yudkin, who I think he warned me that he would have to sign off early. But he's the blurbist that you quoted. Jeremy and I were friends back from boarding school days, and Jeremy and his wife Catherine, or Jeremy moved to California and married his wife Catherine here long before I got out here. But when I did get out here, I asked him to introduce me to all the poets he knew, and Charlotte was it. So that's how that is how we were introduced, and we had a very we were both married to other people, and we just were poetry friends for a long time.
Well, that's lovely. That's lovely to know. So thank you for sharing that, and thank you for sharing your wonderful words with us today.
My pleasure.
I'm now going to turn to our second reader of the afternoon, David Hargraves. So David, you are unmuted. You can step up to the mic.
Oh, okay, thank you. Yeah, well, thank you, Larry, for having me, and thank you, Broadstone folks, for doing such a fantastic job on the book. I'm thrilled to be part of the Broadstone community. I don't know if it's appropriate. Can we call ourselves Broadstoners? Does that work?
I am going to jump in to say that is my official term for our community. So you are, in fact, all of you are Broadstoners, however you want to put the emphasis on that.
Okay, good to know. And then, yeah, thanks to all the folks who came, a lot of familiar faces and friends. I really do appreciate it. So I'm just gonna go ahead and start reading. For those of folks on the West Coast, they know that we're having a weather event off the coast, and which is quite exciting. weather these days is not just something that you observe or that poets sit around and contemplate. Weather has become a symptom of something more serious and diabolical, perhaps. So maybe we can put that in the perspective for this first poem. It's called The Library Window, and the epigraph here is by Borges, who wrote a famous short story about the library, and the epigraph is "Nonsense is normal in the library." We all were fretting, will the drought break before the ferns on the boulevard turn brittle brown, and then, like lepers, lose their fingers? So it made sense when clouds coaxed in from the ocean let down. We didn't mind the parking lot drizzle, the rainbow oil slicks surrounding the coffee kiosk, painted pumpkin and lime, so long as cars still idled in line for lattes and Americanos. But our elders, who knew their weather, furrowed their brows, noting how dusty Main Street seemed, no longer clogged with farm machinery, no muscular tractors, no pesticide sprayers with long-armed nozzles folded like wings, no more hay rigs holding up traffic, annoying the hybrids and SUVs already late for their couples counseling. Yet, not until the bohemian waxwings gathered like poets in ash trees, thirsting to gorge on the last orange berries, get garrulous drunk and fly smack dab into the library window, did we admit the heat was news that's staying news. And for those of you playing, keeping score at home, you get a point if you recognize the quote there. There'll be a quiz later on that. So the next poem is also a weather poem. The ocean is apparently rather upset today. This is a poem about a calm ocean. It's called Dream Vista. The Pacific swells and rolls unhurried, sidling up to a jagged cliff along the coastline, then exhales. Harmonic wave oscillation, oceanographers love to say. Yet were the sea still a god, we'd say it slumbers. Ebb and flow, each high followed by a low trough exposing mollusk-crusted fissures, cracks recessed deep into crevices, teeming with shifty-eyed marine lowlife, clammed up, clinging to rocks, the usual riffraff of my unconscious. All right, so since you asked about my unconscious, let's shall we delve into my unconscious here? Let's do so. This is a poem called What I Wanted. I used to dream of being ravished, decomposed into smutty loam, then reborn a luscious fern or redwood trunk thrusting skyward above the arms of maple saplings, praying to what little light chaos allotted. What I got instead, a quota of koi and lily pads floating on duckweed sedated ponds, appetite tame as houseplants hung from macrame parachutes, dropped onto sweater vest lawns with groin-high hedges. All I do now is sit and sip wine beside the new fountain while the old fountain pens sign the treaty. The latest Versailles concession to the bonsai garden path, so zen clean shaven, so well pruned, yet always, always, always thirsty. Okay, so the title for the volume, the collection is will appear at the end of this poem. There it comes in 3 parts, and it's called The Rule of Threes. And I should add I should want to thank Natalie Laswell for the beautiful cover. These 3 poems came as in a series of 3 actually, and she painted 3 pieces that went with the poems. They were I don't know, maybe some of you out there, I know that ekphrastic means when you write a poem about a painting, but is there a term for when people do paintings about poems? I'm not familiar. Again, that'll be, maybe we can check it on the quiz at the end of the session here. But we submitted it for a grant to see if we could get a residency, and then COVID killed everything. So we still have those beautiful paintings, and I was just delighted that I could use it as the cover of the book. Okay, so the name of the series of 3 poems is called The Rule of Threes. A dream receding leaves behind a tideline rack of stranded driftwood, shell and pebble, surf rolled, randomized, let go, a shoreline swath of stochastic beauty. Beach detritus arrayed in bell curves, plotting the chance of a lifetime, or the chance of my brother drowning, or my wife's cancer. Part 2. A dream of more pebbles raked in their bed by the braided waters of a stream where salmon spawn out rot in shallows, where collared doves coo Unitarian hymns above quiet pools, where lazy eddies swirl and shades drift between trees. Part 3. A dream of black hoods on sapphire jays, flocking in the tops of fir trees, my tutelary deities scolding, they all know me as I am carried along by the current, inner tube leaking like an old dictionary, running out of words for afterwards. Well, one thing I noticed about Patrick poems is birds make quite an appearance in several of his poems. The crows and ravens in particular, I really enjoyed that. I had one of my mentors, the late Peter Sears, when we would do workshops, he at one point banned birds from any of the poems that we brought, because there were just too many of us were bringing birds, and he banned them for a while, which is probably a good thing. But this is a poem about birds, okay? It's called Gray Matter. It's not just about birds, by the way. It's called Gray Matter, and it begins with an epigraph from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology describing the northern harrier, which will make an appearance later in the poem. Adult males are grayish above with a dark trailing edge on the wing. So that describes the harrier, or does it? I'm attracted to wetlands, not just for the beauty of Linnaeus and Darwin's legalese, but for the miles of ponderous mire, cattail flowers in various stages of fray, like my brain waves of wispy cotton drifting among the chatter of red-winged blackbirds, past oasis of memory, duckweed, pond lily, in Latin, limonade, nupfar, since you asked. I'm drawn to wetlands, not just for the gist between the lines of sedge and reed thickets, bittern's galumph or wren's territorial prattle, but for the sacred weekend in May. When grosbeaks lollygag trill glissandos through Mother's Day, preaching from an ash grove, truth universal as pollen, reminding me, call mom, she knew the Latin names for all the birds, but now she's forgotten even mine. Still, the words in the Gospel of Peterson tell me northern harrier, Circus hudsonius, my avatar hunting low over the marsh, still carries within an insatiable want. Third eye scanning my inner life for the slightest sign of voles. So there's a hint there, I suppose, at age. And so this poem is going to definitely date me. The poem is not that old, but it goes back to roughly 1973. There's going to be two references here. I think most of us will get the one, Johnson as the president, and then the Ford River Rouge plant is the major industrial sort of center for manufacturing Ford motor cars in Detroit. And even as kids in elementary school, we would we do field trips down to watch them make cars. And Emily, my friend Emily, sort of shaking her head. She knows, and it's an amazing complex. So it makes an appearance here. Okay. There are also some birds. Okay, it's called Learning Curve. When I found out screech owls don't actually, they whistle and trill desire and defense, I cringed. Turns out it was a barn owl screeching from its hole in a sycamore all night that reminded me of hearing my girlfriend's pleasure through the wall next door while I munched cold pizza with my dealer, Rachel, from across the hall, and tried not to stare at her shriveled arm or mispronounce thalidomide, asking nonchalant. I didn't expect she'd let me in or call me out, and just how cruelly everyone gawked when she dropped her cafeteria tray, tater tots rolling across the tiles, or how cruel we all have been to let that fucker Johnson call up more troops for his dirty war. Even crueler, the cute lifeguard never returned home to our city pool. He was always kind to me, she said. It's always kids like him, whose dad worked the line at Ford River Rouge, stood with the union, got beat up by the company thugs. Dense as I am, I was unaware it was so late when she leaned her cheek on my shoulder, exhaled a smoky fucking A, and passed me back the bong, asking, did you know him? Okay, so there's a series of poems. There's a set of 4 here. I'm only going to read 2. I'm going to read the second and the fourth. The whole group is called Awe is Real. And I am going to read I should mention, I am going to read an epigraph from the poet, and his name is Durgalal Shrestha, is the poet from Nepal that I translate. And the language is actually called Nepal Bhasa. So, and sometimes it's called Nawari, but Nepal Bhasa is the name that the Nawars prefer. In his book, The Blossom of 64 Sunsets, the conceit behind it is he's standing on a rooftop 64 days in a row, which corresponds to the number of years of his brother lived and had recently passed away, and he meditates on the sunset. Now, this can sound kind of new agey, and when people heard about it, they say, oh, gee, that, sunsets, that's been done, all right? But these are not your typical sunset poems, and they're very quirky, and it's not new agey at all. They're enigmatic. They're very challenging to make sense of because they're imagistic and so on. So this is not. So when I read the first poem, this was one of the lines in the poem, and this is what got me interested in translating him. So he's describing how he's looking at the sun and he's imagining the sun leaving. The sun says to him, okay, I'm out of here. Kind of like the sun is riding into the sunset, kind of an image. And then all of a sudden, the sun turns around and looks him right in the eye. And at that moment, the poet experiences the sense of awe, being overwhelmed by emotion and grief and so on. That's the moment in the poem. And he writes it like this, and this is what got me hooked on his poetry. So imagine him now being overwhelmed that the sun has turned and looked him face to face. I respond silently, mouth open wide, as a bowl of curd freshly solidified. I read that line, I thought, what a startling image. And if you've been around people who've made yogurt, then you see, like in the windows, that whole image of not just the sun setting, but of the curd coagulating as some kind of an emotional description. I just thought, okay, this is someone I need to really understand his poems. So this series was really based on my reaction to some of his work. Now it's also a little more playful and goes in different places. So the second part of the series, it's called Corn Dogs. And the epigraph comes from the patent for corn dogs, which is, I think, late 1800s, if I remember right. And it simply says, impaled on sticks and dipped in batter. And that's from the patent. Right? From the privileged view of the shampooed county fair blue ribbon goat nose poking through the slats, the two of us smell like sex, each holding our pink hornet's nest of cotton candy as we tease off synonyms for fear, reverence, wonder, desire, all swirled into awe the kind philosophers call the sublime, to wafer on each other's tongues. So the second one is called Oldie Station, and the epigraph here is from an English ballad. We be three poor mariners newly come from the seas. We spend our lives in jeopardy while others live at ease. And the poem is called Oldie Station. Awe will appear as unintended. Agency, say the ocean, between my ears, a playlist, algorithm, random as sand fleas dancing on crab shells gleaned by gulls. Meanwhile, gale force winds flatten the dune grass, sending skittish birds to shelter in coastal groves of gnarled Sitka spruce, bent in awe of the offshore will. Listen, another white-crowned sparrow rewinds that same old cassette. Okay, so Larry, I'm gonna leave it up to you to give me the sign here. Okay. All right, so this is more recent. This is a poem that's more recent, obviously, than the one from Detroit. It's from 2016, and it's called Elegy for an Election. We've nothing left but the rind of ourselves peeled from the whole, paired like an orange globe, a Mercator projection, our future pinned to the classroom wall by alien cartographers. 2 months ago, when the polar axis wobbled away from true north, when the sky ignited screensaver colors, when the otherworldly spacecraft landed as I was raising her cusp to my lips, her back arching, gasping, pulling my hair, and then we watched TV like the rest. Us and the billions, Earth, the networks called it early, now a mere crossroad midden where they've come to bury their afterbirth, dump their trash, and advertise the rapture. How to commemorate our own apocalypse, how to observe. We sit in orange Naugahyde chairs playing gin rummy in a double wide. I'm so happy, I chain smoke cools, sip 7 and 7. Our eyes gaze up, tracking the ceiling fan strobe illusions, shadows paddling backwards, even the cat's confused, swatting at empty air. Okay, so I know we have several, I think, several familiar faces and friends, one of whom at least I know is professionally a philosopher. Thank goodness that he's not going to call me out on this, but this is a poem that comes from the overly used, but overly familiar, I should say, quote from Heraclitus, no man, no person steps in the same river twice, and so on and so forth. It's often misquoted, often misunderstood, but that's not the point. Okay, all right, step in the same river twice. Heraclitus says we can't, but then again, he's never been to Utah. He would never understand how two geeks could meet through math inside the curly brackets, both wanting to follow the order of operations, and how at dinner we discover a scatter plot of poppy seeds on a white tablecloth and scribble together on a Sazerac stained napkin the formula for why not leave Salt Lake, rent a Prius, drive due west, and doing 85, calculate the path of a hawk lifted off from the ditch exploding on our grill. He couldn't predict how a gravel truck rattles past, shooting pebbles, how our windshield wisecracks about the sky, although he should have seen at midnight how oncoming brights from a bully pickup rushing drunk towards us cried, repent, repent. Luckily, a jerk of the wheel saves us onto the shoulder where we weep, hug, kiss, fuck under the hatchback, fall asleep. I'm certain he never dreamed of an Oregon high desert sunrise or watched the John Day River snuggle a cliff, curl into a pool across from where we stand together on a pebble shore. We sacrifice our bacon fat from the skillet to the god of fire. We say a prayer, then step goosebump naked, clasping hands, two souls in the same river once, as the current, so revered by our esteemed philosopher, struggles to grasp the simple idea of feet. Okay, so I'm kind of calculating what I want to make sure there's a few at the end. Larry, where are we at time-wise here? So I want to make sure I don't.
We've got, why don't you plan on, you can do about 5 more minutes easily.
Okay.
Yeah, and still give us some time for a little conversation at the end.
I'm going to read 3 more poems and that will kind of finish up. Okay, so another theme in the volume. First of all, I suppose the volume can be characterized that one of the themes is the impermanence, the idea that nothing is ever stable, and Heraclitus, I think, is hinting at that. Along with the concept of the self, we are never really a true self. We are always something other than what we would imagine to be a true self. It's a very Buddhist principle. And then another theme would be that language is never up to the task of trying to accommodate and account for our experience. So these are 3 poems that actually deal with language, okay? The first one is the first one in the collection, and it's called No Tongue Can Tell. And it's located at an actual place in Kathmandu along the Bagmati River. There was, when I first went there, before they built an auto bridge, there was just a footbridge, and it crossed over a section where just upstream there were the cremation grounds, and certainly in that area, there were ghosts populated the riverbank. That was well understood. No one really wanted to walk across that bridge at night, and you only did with your friends, and it gave you goosebumps. It just was a haunted place, and that was well understood. And there were lots of accounts of seeing ghosts confronting people on the bridge and so on, which I never questioned because it certainly felt like it was a possibility to me. So this poem is called No Tongue Can Tell. Crossing the Bagmati River at night, we could see from the Black Bridge fires along the riverbank, smell cremation. A language of flame without words for tongue or lick, yet in translation, we drink smoke from cigarettes as if straws in moonshine, high poured into shallow clay cups, frothy bubble eyes winking. Each dawn, pigeons on my window ledge mumbled love, while an old man opened a different window, ratcheted up his morning phlegm, gobbed into the courtyard 3 floors down, scattering the chickens. Do you wonder, as I do, is all this connected? Taxi horns and the peal of a temple bell. Do you wonder, is anything not? Okay, so 2 poems, these 2 poems go together. Then this second to the last one is probably as close to nonsense as I get pretty close to nonsense, but this is not, there's no narrative here. Let's put it this way. So you got it. It's meant for the pure sort of joy of putting words together. And it's called Ordinary Language. And it begins with an epigraph by the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. And he asks the question, what is the difference between searching for a word in memory and searching for a friend in the park? Let us attack the question, first by asking the slide rule how a worker feels getting laid off. Then ask the red nectar feeder what it thinks about hummingbirds choosing smack over fuchsia. Now translate this into emoji just to see how meaning gets lost, traded off for 68 Tigers baseball cards. Some of us explode at the thought, act out in daycare, throw letter blocks. Some of us get stoned behind the wheel until an unmarked song comes along on the radio, pulls us over, catches us weeping. We fess up, sputtering like summer sprinklers, trying to endure the starling's jeer from a dead oak, trusting the night shift to clean up the mess. It's so easy to misconstrue is no excuse. In any case, hey, you're quite the grilled cheese sandwich, was never a compliment, more like a threat. Even Humpty Dumpty knows he's liable to take home the wrong pair of pants from the cleaner. And then this last poem is actually the first poem I ever published. And it's still, I still actually enjoy reading it, and it really does sort of characterize one of the most profound experiences I had trying to learn the Nepal Bhasa language, and coming across so many occasions where I simply didn't understand the word and the concept because I didn't have the cultural background at the time. And so the particular word is a word that's it describes a certain taste of food that I was unable to, and it turns out I didn't realize at the time Japanese has the term, and now people are pretty familiar with this fifth, dry, sweet, sour, and so on. But at the time wasn't aware of it, and I just struggled to find a word that described this particular sensation on the tongue. Okay, so this is called language lesson. Due north of sweet mangoes let me start over. Due north of sweet mango summer's slippery pulp between the teeth, or frothy chia in fog-bound winter steaming cardamom and clove. Far east of bitter greens, garlic and pouty little fruit, omelet in hot and sour soup. West of the fire, flesh from the butcher, fresh green chili fried with fingerfuls of pounded rice flakes and grandma's moonshine, Ayla. Poured high from a narrow spout, bubble eyes splashing in a shallow clay cup. South of the salt trade, Buddha's footfalls, ancient paths along the paddy where anklets jangle gracefully past tender shoots, impatient for the monsoon to mount the Himalayas. There is a place on the tongue, chew slowly, savor, a moment English cannot reach. Thank you so much.
All right. Bravo, David. What wonderful reading, and thank you so much for inviting us into the riffraff of your unconscious, as you described it. Several things I could talk about. One, it's interesting when I put writers together for these series, I'm usually trying to find a good connection. So I now realize retroactively, after listening to you and Patrick, that birds were a good connection today. And I have to say, in your case, David, that the three that I noted is describing bohemian waxwings as poets, which I don't think is particularly complimentary to us poets. But probably very appropriate. And I love that the doves were cooing Unitarian hymns, which is wonderful. And then sparrows rewinding cassettes. Just lovely, lovely images. And I'm joking a little bit, but that really does speak to the inventiveness of your language and imagery. We've alluded to this in my introduction, and you mentioned it somewhat in your reading. Talk a little bit, I was asking Patrick about how he came to poetry. I've had the sense that you came into your own poetry, at least somewhat, through this process of translation. So can you tell us just a little bit more about that process for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, like probably everybody here, I always had an interest in poetry, and interesting, Patrick described the Mark Antony speech. The only poem I can ever recall my father reading to me was that speech, actually. I still have a very clear memory of it. He's not exactly a poet type person, but he thought that was really a remarkable piece to read. So, but nothing serious. I took one poetry class as an undergraduate, and that was it. But then when I started to get interested in this translation project, and it really was based on just coming across a book of poems by this author and just trying it out and thinking, these are amazing poems. And so, and this was, oh boy, maybe 15 years ago that I first encountered his work. Then I started asking myself, well, what kind of voice do I need in English in order to be able to sort of translate his poems? How do I understand his voice relative to his cultural context and the genre of poetry that he writes in Nepal Bhasa? And how do I find an English equivalent? So then I just started reading like crazy. And I think it's something useful to imagine that you study something outside of its academic context. So I just read any poet from old, new, anywhere in the world. I just read as much as I could and started writing. And I just want to give a shout out here to my good friend, poet Henry Hughes, who all along the way was more than willing to read my poems and give me feedback on them. And we've developed a fantastic relationship through that. But along the way, just reading everybody and finding that, you know, there are, and not really in the end subscribing to the sort of canonical account of what the major works of English poetry are. The finding that's not really interesting, but this is, and no one ever talks about this person, and so on and so forth. And eventually I just started writing, and then I did the translation work and spent some time talking with the poet Durgalal Shrestha, and you know, he worked with a couple of us who worked together as a kind of team at first. So I learned a lot about poetry just from listening to him talk about his own process. And there is one kind of humorous anecdote. We were sitting around a fire at one point, and I was trying, in Nepal Bhasa, I was trying to make the metaphor, trying to be creative. And I tried to say in Nepal Bhasa that the tongue, the fire was licking the wood, you know, the tongues of the fire, and, you know, the flame and lit. And it turns out that image does not exist in Nepal Bhasa. And they all looked at me like I was nuts, or they didn't understand me because I wasn't really a very fluent speaker at the time. But then Durgalal got it, and he just burst out laughing, and he was so thrilled that he would tell this story from that point. He said, "Oh man, he's a real poet. Here's a metaphor he made up." You know, and it's like, well, okay, I'll take credit for that. But that really got me also interested in writing and thinking about how poems work. And, you know, Durgalal's poems are not, they're challenging. And so I thought, well, that's a model. You can be challenging. You don't have to be accessible all the time, you know.
Well, I think we can be grateful that you had that model. And I'm also fascinated at your autodidactic approach to just immersing yourself in poetry. And again, although you are an academician, not coming out of that poetry tradition so much. So I think with the case of both of our poets today, it's always, I think, refreshing to find people who are writing from these other perspectives. I will ask one very specific question about your poetic style. And this is where it's so wonderful for me to hear people read their own work. And with Patrick, it was very nice to hear it with his particular accent and tonality and everything. What I noticed, David, with yours is in several of your poems, there's a very staccato, very rapid, very staccato, at least delivery in the way you're reading them that I perhaps didn't get just, you know, reading them myself or in my head. Is that in any way derived from your Nepal Bhasa poetry, or is that, how did that come about, do you think?
Well, I think it's a little less interesting than that. No, it's not related. It's more, when I was practicing reading them aloud, I found myself slurring and stumbling over, you know, words that, you know, lines and phrases that really sounded good to me in my head when I wrote them down. And then all of a sudden trying to actually perform them, not just say them, but really turn it into a performance kind of mode of reading. I realized that's hard to say that many R's in a row, or that many L's. And so there were cases where I were really kind of slowing myself down because I found myself just rolling words together in ways that then I had to back up and start the line all over and stuff.
Interesting. Did that cause you at any point to go back and rethink or revise any of your lines when you were thinking about how they read as aloud as opposed to just on the page?
Well, I mean, when I workshop these with, when not formal workshops, but with just friends, Henry mostly, we would read them out loud, or we would take turns reading each other's. And so they seem to work, they seem to work for, I don't know. I just, maybe a little bit of nerves or something. I found myself tripping over my tongue. I don't think that the language naturally would lead everybody to do that. I think I just found myself, probably out of nerves more than anything else. So I made a point of slowing down.
Yeah, I totally get that, because even though I practice my introductions to all of these, I always trip over something, as I did in my introduction to you. Anyway, lovely, great conversation. And I think another line from one of your poems that I think is a good way of tying this together is the line, is anything not connected? And I think it's wonderful, David, in your work, Patrick, in yours, where you do make such wonderful connections in your poetry. So I'm at this point, I'm going to invite everyone to do the Zoom applause to the camera and thank our wonderful two readers. And we have a few minutes. I'm going to put my screen on gallery view so I can see who's left, those who have their cameras on. We have a few minutes. Is there anyone else who has a question or comment? And especially Patrick, if you have any response you want to make to David, or any interchange between the two of you, but we can take just a minute or few for a little conversation here.
Well,
David,
yeah, sorry.
I'm interested in your background in linguistics, which I think is to understand words and the kind of the way language works. I think is I don't think enough people who are or want to be poets pay enough attention to that, or have an interest in it, perhaps. And I was wondering if it was if your interest in language was part of what brought you to poetry.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think that my interest, I started out undergraduate in psychology and, wildlife biology, looked at organic chemistry, said, no way, I'm not going to do that field. And then I sort of wandered my way into linguistics, not really knowing what it was, and then realized how much I really liked that approach to language. But a lot of people think of linguistics and poetry as being actually really different from one another. They think the analytical, sort of theoretical components as really soul killing. I mean, I teach undergraduates linguistics and grammar, and they think it's soul killing. So, whereas my friend Henry gets to teach them poetry, and they love it. So, it's a tough blend, actually.
Huh. Yeah, I have to say that it seems to me to be a natural blend. It's kind of like an architect knowing about how to lay bricks, I would guess.
Yeah, I wish more people would see it that way. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, and I'll observe, poetry is one form of writing that everyone seems to think they can do, whether they have any background at all. And I used to describe myself as kind of a grammar and punctuation Nazi. I'm a little less so now than I used to be, but I would always say that you need to know what the rules are in order to break them creatively. And that's the difference between work that is just sloppy and work that really takes the language in unique and interesting directions. So that would be my gloss on why linguistics, or any study of grammar and form, I think is really essential to the practice of poetry.
Yeah.
Would anyone else like to unmute and ask a question or make a comment?
I did want to say to Patrick, again, how much I enjoyed your poems, and you are part of, I think, a long tradition of poets who write poetry aside from their day job, whether they're insurance salesmen or whatever. So I think you're in good company there. And I really admire the fact that you can keep your brain fresh to write poems even after you've been working all day and so on. So that's quite an accomplishment.
Thank you.
All right. Last call. Well, this has been an excellent.
I would
yes.
like to thank
Okay, Dachin.
last call.
Oh, yeah.
I want to thank all of you who put this together, Patrick and David, and Patrick, the second poem about your father, and especially that last line about the shadow. I don't know, it brought me to tears, and that those moments, there are those moments, and sometimes they're far and few between, depending on who your parents are. Sometimes there's lots of them. I'm thinking those were far and few between, and then the image of you wanting to hold his hand longer. Yeah. Anyway, it was so moving to me.
Yeah.
And
Thank you
for all of them, and thank you for your poem about Bob. And you know, he's with us. He's hanging out. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks, Dachin. I'm sorry Bob didn't live long enough to become a Broadstone poet. I think Larry would have liked his work.
Yes, I think that's true. So
You must share some with me. I would love to see some. Ryan, were you just flinching a moment ago, or you looked like you might be about to ask a question?
I do have a question, and this is a question either for David or Patrick. I'd be interested in hearing a response to this, but it's you know, in front of one of his poems, David said that it was a poem that was closer to nonsense. It's the one that had Humpty Dumpty and Wittgenstein, right, and the cheese and the grilled cheese sandwich. And I think I understand what he meant by that as being less narrative, that poem, than some of the other poems, right, that we heard today. But I still feel like I understood a lot of what was happening in that poem. It wasn't complete nonsense to me in the sense that I didn't, I don't know, it made a lot of sense, right, to me, that kind of nonsense. So I just wonder what is going on there with poets, right? And are they, you know, what are you doing with the meanings of the words and the images and the metaphors, right? You're making new meaning, right? It seems like maybe the opposite of nonsense. It's very, it's creative, right? It's very meaningful. And I just would invite, I wonder what your reaction is to that, right? Was that poem really nonsense? I don't feel like it was nonsense.
Patrick, do you want to?
Oh, it's your poem. You should, or unless you.
Well, I have to say that Henry, who you know, of course, he and I have gone round and round on, you know, just the question of what makes poems accessible or not, and how, you know, meaning can be, you know, oblique, and, you know, there's a point in which it becomes tiresome and it just makes you want to quit reading. But on other cases, you know, I happen to have, you know, found John Ashbery's poems in many cases to be absolutely brilliant and beautiful, even though I understood almost nothing of what he was doing. But then there are other sort of oblique poets where I run out of energy halfway through the first stanza. So I don't know. I think it's got to have a flow of some type. There's got to be a sense. This is what I love about the best of Ashbery's stuff, is that there's a sense of movement and there's a sense of development, even if there's no resolution. And I think it's a real, you know, it's a real trick. It's really a challenge to be able to do that, you know, and it can go wrong very quickly, I think. Yeah.
And I would just say, to me, that gets back to that point we were making a moment ago about you know, knowing the rules and breaking the rules. And poetry is a wonderful example of evolving language to take other forms. And I think to your point, David, about I too have read those poems that just become very tiresome because it's just the poet trying to be overly clever, as opposed to where you might have to struggle to get at the understanding and maybe not even get there, but you love where the language takes you. And I'll mention we have another poet in the room today who does a good job of that also, and that's Esteban Olarte, who's not he's doesn't have his camera on, but he's in the room today too. So it's a wonderful point. Okay, we are right at the end of our time today. So once again, round of applause for our readers, who were quite wonderful. David, Patrick, what a delight. Certainly for me to get to hear you and for everyone in the audience today. Most of you are joining us today for the first time because you're fans of one or the other of these two. Hopefully, whichever one you came here because you knew, you've now met the other. And I'll point out that nothing shows your appreciation for a writer or a publisher like buying their books. And if you check in the chat, there is a link, or if you go to broadstonebooks.com, and please do, where you'll find not only David and Patrick's books, but all of our titles. And also that's a good place to keep up with what we're doing at Broadstone. Please join our community. Please, we do these events each month. And I encourage you to become part of our Broadstone family. So to all of you, again, thank you for spending an afternoon, whether it was an early afternoon or a late afternoon, with us today, and hope to see you again.
Thank you. Thank you, Larry. Thanks so much.
Okay, great rest of the day,
Larry.
everyone.
Thank you everyone for coming.
All right, Stephanie, thanks for crewing again, you and